My name is Bob Kerrey. I'm president of the New School, and I'm very happy and pleased to welcome Senator Tom Daschle, who was my leader in the United States Senate and has been a friend of mine for many, many years. He was in Congress for, I think, 25 total, or 25 plus, or something like that in the House before he came to the Senate. He represented South Dakota. I am president of South Dakota. Actually, it's the only state that I won in 1992. I'm doubly happy to have Tom here. Tom has written a book called Critical Care that those of us who care about this issue of health care have actually read. And though the first thing I want to talk to Tom about is how much ignorance there appears to be in the debate itself. In fact, I think that's the requirement to get on talk television. That if you know anything about it, they don't invite you on the show. But I want to just sort of the ground rules. We'll go to 7:30. I'll try to cut off our conversation a bit so that the cards that you've been passed out, we'll take them and we'll take questions as quickly as we can, so that this can be as much a conversation between you and Senator Daschle as it is between Senator Daschle and myself. Let me begin, Tom, asserting that I think health care is, by a long ways, the most complicated and the most difficult from the standpoint of people are very emotional about it. So it's because of the complicated nature of the issue and the emotional nature of the issue, it seems to me that that understanding is enormously important in order to get anything done. And one of the friends of the university, Alan Siegel's company, did a survey of people who claim that they understand what's going on in this thing. And when you ask them specific questions, for example, about the public option or about the coverage of abortion, or the controversial things you hear all the time, they actually don't understand it. And after you select people who claim they understand it, who say that they do understand it, they still don't. And I wonder if you just start with that, as I think tucked in there somewhere in that statement was a question. If you would agree, I mean, that's one of the big barriers, that people really don't understand how the system works, and as a consequence, it's very, very easy to frighten people and to demagogue on the issue to say that nothing ought to be done.
Well, I think it's fair to say it's probably the least transparent of any sector of our economy. In just about everything across the board, as you look at the policy, as you look at the practice, as you look at how it affects each of us, it's not very transparent. You probably know more about any baseball player in the New York Yankees in their stats and what their record is than you do about your own doctor. So there is a lot of mystery around it. It's the only sector of the economy, Bob, where at the point of purchase, in most cases, you don't know who's going to pay or what it's going to cost, but you've already made the purchase. And so that lack of transparency is, I think, one of the huge problems. And everybody, as they try to get their arms around it, it's almost like being blind and describing an elephant. Everybody's got their own handle on a leg or a tusk or a trunk, and they will describe what they see as a part of their experience. But nobody sees the whole picture, in part because of the lack of transparency, in part because it's so big a part of our economy, $2.5 trillion, 1,300 payers. So every payer may have a different experience with the patients and with those who insure. So it affects us all differently. And as a result, we all have different perceptions of what the issues are and really what the system looks like.
Well, why when, I don't know, 60% of all expenditures are either direct or indirect by the government, why does the accusation that we're talking about socialism here, why is that so effective? Why does that render people speechless in this debate? Because there seems to be a fear of that accusation.
Well, I actually, first of all, I think that the concern is that we've all conjured up notions of socialism as something akin to communism, and everybody's been taught since they were in school that communism is a bad thing, and so this is a move towards something that we've been taught is very bad. And because it's a fear of the unknown, people are willing to believe it because they are taught to believe what they hear on television or read in the newspapers. And so that assertion, made over and over again, you know, others used to say that a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth gets its shoes on. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. When it comes to these charges, these hyperbolic descriptions of what it is we're talking about, because they don't know, they're willing to hang on things they do know, and they know something, they think they know something about socialism, even though they probably don't.
Well, you and I both know a little bit about the legislative process. What's your prediction? We're going to get a bill that the president signs?
Well, I don't think it's, if you're talking about a comprehensive health care reform package, I'd say the prospects are probably no better than 50-50 today. You know, if I had to guess today, I'd say there's more of an inclination now than there has ever been to go to the reconciliation track. As you know, as everyone here probably knows, we're on the policy track
Presume
now.
they don't know what reconciliation is.
Well, that's probably a good point. There are two different legislative tracks. There's the policy track, which involves the 5 committees that you may have heard something about, 3 committees in the House and 2 committees in the Senate, all charged with the responsibility of coming up with a policy that would allow us to deal with all the problems of health care, generally problems associated with cost, access, and quality. You need 60 votes in the Senate to pass the legislation on what is called the policy track. If you don't get the 60 votes, then in this case, because health care is such a budget-driven policy issue, you can go to the budget track, which has 2 advantages. One, it's always considered on what is called a fast track. There are 40 hours of debate, and then you have to have a vote. And the vote threshold is not 60 votes, it's 50 votes. So it is likely that if we fail on the policy track within the next month, the leadership in the House and Senate will then move to the budget track, and you'll see this considered on an expedited basis. Now there are disadvantages, and the biggest disadvantages, as Bob can describe just as well as I can, the biggest disadvantage is that not everything fits in the context of a budget. There are things like insurance reform that don't really have budgetary, at least scorable budgetary implications. So as a result, that would have to be taken out of the budget track. So most likely you would pass a bill that is probably 2/3 or 3/4 what the policy track would allow. And that's a concern that everybody has. You'd probably have to take that up individually and still try to pass it with that 60-vote threshold.
Because it seems, first of all, one of the rules, I don't know if you've used this rule, but one of the rules that I always carried with me in politics was never try to negotiate an agreement with somebody who's going to disagree with you in the end anyway. So sort of baffled me why Senator Baucus was trying to put a deal together with Mike Enzi. I never thought that either Senator Enzi or Senator Grassley were likely, at the end of the day, to support what was it, you know, that Senator Baucus thought they were going to agree to, because they're so ideologically different. So now it seems to me you've got something coming potentially coming out of finance that is not going to get any Republicans and may not get enough Democrats. So is it your sense of the matter that as a consequence of this general confusion that a large portion of the financing piece is going to have to go in reconciliation? And if so, what do you think that's apt to be? What pieces do you think will go in reconciliation?
Well, I think that most of all of the governmental programs related to health, that is Medicare, Medicaid, how it's funded, the determination in terms of access, the subsidy levels, all of those things are scorable budget issues that could be incorporated. There's another downside to the budget track, which I failed to mention, which is that everything expires in 5 years. It has to be reauthorized in 5 years. So that's also a big impediment. So I would say that, you know, most of what we know of today as government-related health policy could fit into the budget track just because it has huge budgetary implications. All of those things that generally fall outside of government responsibility for health may or may not fall into the budget track, depending on whether or not it has budgetary implications.
And those things that could increase the transparency of the process, you think those are likely to have to go on the policy track and more likely to pass as a result? Because there seems to be agreement between Republicans and Democrats on that issue.
That's right. No, I think that transparency issues are probably not budgetary. I mean, you could probably argue that in some cases it allows greater budget clarity, and as a result, maybe some of it could be written in such a way as to be incorporated. But I think it's a safe assumption that most of that would probably fall outside the policy track, outside the budget track.
One of the, and there's a number of issues that have been quite contentious, and the issues that are quite contentious, in my view, are the ones that are most likely to get misrepresented, or just misrepresented, actually, probably a nice way of putting it. The public option is the one that's the men probably of greatest interest to me. I'm going to begin by saying, if I was I was a governor once, you know, and if I was a right-wing governor today, there's sort of a certain appeal to it, you know, the certainty of being a right wing. It's a lot easier to figure out what you're for. So let's say I'm a right-wing governor. I was going to say the governor of South Carolina, but that's not a very good name to be these days. Although I do love Argentina. I'd be for socializing the insurance part. I'd be for creating a federal system of insurance. And why? I mean, in New York, Medicaid costs $56 billion a year. California, I don't know what the number is. It's probably in that neighborhood. I mean, they got strikes in academia going on in California right now. If you're a governor, you'd want to federalize the payment system because you take Medicaid off your books. I mean, you could propose a 40% tax cut in the state of New York and still have $10 billion left over to spend. I don't understand why the public option isn't seen for what it is, which is a nationalization, a creating of a national system, and particularly on the political level. If you're a governor, likely thinking about maybe you're going to run against the senator someday for office, you want them to have to raise the taxes. So you're in a position to say, I'm for, if I was a governor, I would have said, your public option isn't strong enough. I want it stronger. I want it so strong that all my Medicaid recipients have an incentive to go on it. And from my standpoint, it isn't just because I live in Greenwich Village now. The longer I've been here, the further to the left I get on health care. I mean, on this one, we calculated the 8% charge if I don't provide health insurance. I think I'd probably pay 12 just to be removed of the thousands of hours that you spend trying to figure out what your health care package is going to be for full and part-time employees. I mean, I really don't get how the public option got demonized so badly and why it became so scary.
That's entirely too rational.
Which is
an explanation.
Which is not characteristic of
which
me.
Is, I think it's pretty basic. I think in the mind of a right-wing Republican governor or any other right-wing politician, what are they afraid of? They're afraid of government. They're afraid of, and they're very wary of government. They're certainly wary of a federal role in just about any sector of society. And so I think they start with that, just an extraordinary distrust, even though you could argue from their bottom line, it would be far better if the federal government or if the country as a whole did what just about every other country in the world has already come to the conclusion they needed to do, which is to make this a national issue, a national responsibility. We did it with Medicare, that is with people over the age of 65, and it's worked pretty well. I mean, in fact, there was I don't know if anybody here saw the article in the New England Journal of Medicine yesterday, but an extraordinary article. The majority of doctors support single payer and a supermajority support a public option. And so there's a great deal of support among providers who are in the field. You know, I always think it's interesting. We ask the generals, what do you think works in Afghanistan or Iraq? Nobody's ever thought about asking the doctors, what do you think works in a hospital or a clinic today? If we'd ask them and say, well, if we ought to follow what doctors' advice we might have here, there would be broad support for a public option or even a single-payer system.
Yeah, I mean, I think of all the things that I'd like to see the president do on this issue, because you and I both remember what happened in 93 and 94. And one of the things that gets airbrushed out, I think, of that historical analysis is that when the healthcare debate ended in 94, it ended. And now President Obama's taking it back up again. And what's your sense if he doesn't get everything that he wants? Do you think that he will continue to work and educate people and help them understand this? Because I mean, I do think 90% of it is just understanding the facts of the case.
Well, as you recall, and you were so involved in all of this back in the 90s, you know, when we lost in 94, there was an assessment that comprehensive health reform, it was just not going to happen. And so we went from what is called comprehensive reform to something called incremental reform, taking up pieces. And I find it so ironic that a lot of our Republican friends today are saying, well, we really ought to take this up on an incremental basis. Let's take it piece by piece. Well, that's exactly what we've done for the last 15 years. And what's happened? Costs have skyrocketed, access has gotten to become even a bigger problem, and the quality in America has gone down precipitously. So incremental changes just don't cut it. What we did was the first incremental change of consequence we took up was children. And we passed the state children's health insurance program, as you recall, in '97. And we helped a few million kids, and it was a good program. By the way, that was done on the budget track. It was done through reconciliation. We didn't have the votes on the policy track, so we actually passed it on the budget track in '97. Then we passed a portability bill that helped a little bit. And then the other big one we passed incrementally was the Part D, Medicare Part D, in the early part of this decade. But in spite of what little accomplishment there's been, there are still those who believe that the incremental approach is the only way to get this done, and I think there's a huge fallacy in believing that somehow things are going to be different for the next 15 years than what they have been now for the last 15.
Well, help me understand this. See, the incremental thing made sense to me after the Senate went from 57 Democrats to 47 Democrats. And it even made sense to me when it was 50-49-1 when you were the leader. But now it's 60-40. What's going on? You know, what was this election all about? It seems to me. Why is it? Why? Because it was one of the battle cries of the campaign. It wasn't like it was hidden under a table or something like this. Why, in your view, are we now back to incremental?
Well, I think in large part, it's because it goes back to your first question. Just people are very confused about what makes the most sense. There's very little confusion about what the problems are. I mean, everybody really understands, I think, that when you've got close to 50 million people uninsured in this country, that's an embarrassment. We're the only industrialized country in the world that has to acknowledge that. Not only that, just about every analytical organization has said that over about half, 48%, of those who have insurance are so poorly insured that they don't get the care they need when they need it. So we have a huge access and coverage problem. We have a cost problem, $8,000 per capita. No country spends that much. And you know, it's getting worse. When I was born, health costs were 4% of gross domestic product. When my kids were born, it went to 8%. When my grandkids were born, it went to 16%. And it's now projected to be 32% if I'm lucky enough to have great-grandkids. I mean, that escalation is phenomenal. Starbucks spends more on health insurance than they do on coffee. And so we've got a huge cost issue. And then we've got a quality problem. You know, we were rated last year by Commonwealth 19th out of 19 industrialized countries when it comes to quality. The World Health Organization lists us 37th, just below Costa Rica and above Slovenia. So we've got a real quality problem. So people agree on the issues, problems, but they have broad disagreements based on ideology, based on personal experience, based on other issues involving the recognition that if you're going to solve these problems, you have to make an initial investment of $1 trillion. Keep in mind, in the context of what we're going to spend, $35 trillion in the next 10 years, $1 trillion is 1/35 of that overall amount. But nonetheless, that's a hard figure to get your arms around when you've got a $1.8 trillion deficit right now.
But again, back to I understand. I mean, you're very eloquent on the problems with our existing system, and it seemed that that's what the campaign was about. And so it's frustrating watching it, even from New York, looking down a short distance to Washington, with so many people coming up here from Washington raising money for their campaigns. It's still it's a little baffling as to why, having, seems to me, made the case in the campaign, being given permission to do it, why it appears to be coming up short.
Well, let me just, in the defense of a Democratic Congress, and I don't have to defend them to you, but I mean, because I know you've followed this too. There are 5 committees, and 4 of the 5 have now passed very, very good health policy. I mean, I have to say, I could be enthusiastic about what the Health, Education, Labor, and Pension Committee in the Senate passed. Very enthusiastic about it. Senator Dodd deserves an incredible amount of credit for the job he did there. They accepted 161 Republican amendments and never got a Republican vote on final passage, in spite of the fact that they tried to accommodate all of those Republican amendments. The House is the same way. They passed 3 bills out of 3 committees, and did an extraordinary job addressing those 3 problems that I briefly described. So 4 out of the 5 committees have done exactly what we would have expected Congress to do in taking up this issue. The last one has been the Finance Committee, and that's where the problems have lied.
So, but is it inaccurate to say that for comprehensive health care reform that August of 2009 was a very, very bad month? Because it seemed to me, when people went home on recess, that they had these town hall meetings, and a bunch of people come and shout and raise Cain, and they started to get a little wobbly kneed. Is that a little unfair?
I think
public opinion seems to change. I mean, I watched this weekend. My God, 60 or 70,000 people show up in Washington, D.C. I mean, that's not by the nation's capital standards. That's it's like 4 people sitting in a booth in a restaurant. That's not a big crowd. But Glenn Beck said it's 1.5 million, and all over the blogs it's 1.5 million, and all the national television are interviewing these people that most of whom I watched didn't have a clue. But people are processing it as if they were experts on the subject. So it seems like public opinion has shifted in a way that, and there seems to be something underlying that means that the debate's even more difficult. If it can shift, now maybe it hasn't shifted. Maybe the public, you were talking about the AMA, maybe public opinion hasn't shifted as much as I keep reading about and listening to people say that it has.
Well, I think public opinion is pretty fluid, and it goes back again to your initial question. People are confused. They're not knowledgeable as I wish they were about some of these issues, and so they're influenced by what they see and what they read. Unfortunately, a lot of what they see and what they read is so sensationalized and so hyperbolic. I had in my own experience, I was asked by the AARP and South Dakota Public Television to come back and do a town hall meeting. This was like months before August, and so I said, of course, I'd be happy to come do it. I get home from time to time, and so this is now August, and these confrontational experiences are being widely reported. I get to my hometown where this town hall meeting is going to be held. There are demonstrators outside, with all kinds of crazy statements on these placards. I get inside, and it's a crowd much like this, and we have the most rational conversation, very good questions. The moderator, like you, is asked extraordinarily insightful questions about all kinds of pieces of it. And the next morning I read the newspaper, and I would say 95% of the coverage in the paper was about the demonstrators and quotes that they had either about me or about health care that were just completely off base. Nothing about the thoughtful, substantive discussion that occurred for an hour and a half in that hall. And that's what's disappointing. I think that the media probably have acted as irresponsibly on this debate as anything I've seen in public life.
But I don't know. But that's an interesting proposition. I've got some examples where I think they may have been worse, but I think that. But it doesn't present a fundamental challenge to our system of democracy that by almost everybody's assessment, you can list an inventory of major problems the way we currently finance and deliver health care, looking at outcomes and all the other things you listed earlier. So the demand for change is there, but the barrier to change, it seems to me, gets erected in this arena where being informed is so important, and it's so easy to misinform. I mean, don't we looking at a major problem with representative government here at this moment?
Well, we are, but I would argue, Bob, that we've had to grapple with that for 200 years. I mean, look at in our lifetime, the civil rights battles of the 1960s and how confrontational they were and how misinformed in some cases they were. Crazy assertions made in some cases. Look at the battles over Vietnam and over the last several years on Iraq. You know, a lot of the big public policy debates have involved emotion, mistruths, allegations, hyperbole, misinformation on the media, and you know, so I don't think from that perspective. I call it the noise of democracy. It's, you know, it's not very stereophonic. It's pretty screechy. It's hard to listen to. It's one of the aspects of democracy that you just have to accept. But what is necessary through all of that, it takes strong leadership from the White House. It takes courage from members of Congress to stand up to those who would distort and destroy the debate, and ultimately work through all of that. And you know, that's the question. Do we have enough members of Congress with the backbone and the vision to allow us the opportunity to move forward on something as critical as health reform in America today? The jury's still out. In the House, I think we could say unequivocally yes. I think what I saw the House do in those three committees, what I think they're prepared to do on the floor, is pretty impressive. And the question is, can we do the same in the Senate?
Yeah, because I mean, the House, as you know, over the last 30 years, they've been gerrymandering every district that's there, so they're all largely safe seats. So I'm impressed by it, but I'm not as impressed by as I will be if the Senate takes similar action. And right in the midst of all this thing, you got the court taking up the case, the Clinton case, and appears to be leaning towards overturning the prohibition against corporate expenditures, which can't improve. My response to a piece of what you'd say, it's true we all have a voice, but some of us have louder voices than others. If I can spend $1 million a day, which the health insurance companies are spending right now, trying to kill a public option, my voice is a bit louder, than somebody for whom $1 million may be a lifetime of wages.
No question. I mean, obviously, it's not a fair fight. And it's not a fair fight in large measure because of what money has done to politics, no question. You know, we've all had to deal with it, and you know, what you hope is that members are going to make the right decisions in spite of the fact that they're heavily influenced by the extraordinary pressures that they feel politically and in other ways, legislatively, as they come to the floor.
So one more time, what do you think will pass? We'll get on the I agree with you, but there'll be, on the reconciliation track, will there be probably what do they call these things, these pools that they're talking about? The
risk pools?
Risk pools, yeah, risk pools.
Purchasing pools,
exchanges?
Pools. Yeah.
That's going to be in there instead of a public option, probably?
Well, here's what I think, first of all, there's going to, if I had to guess.
Can you tell me what those are? I couldn't remember the name of them. What is it?
The exchange?
Yeah, what is an exchange?
Well, first of all, every state would set up a pool for the uninsured and anybody else who wants to participate. Employers could participate if they wanted to. All those resources would be collected. In South Dakota, it would probably be a regional pool because South Dakota's got such a small population base. They wouldn't have the actuarial ability to probably address a risk pool as consequential as it would have to be. So you could have South and North Dakota, Wyoming and Montana, say, but pools would be created Within that pool, a marketplace would then be set. And in that marketplace, commonly called now an exchange, in that exchange, insurance companies would be invited to participate on 3 conditions. First of all, you've got to take all comers. It's something called guaranteed issue. You'd have to guarantee that everybody could participate, regardless of their health condition or economic status. The second thing you would have to do is to apply approximately the same insurance premium for all of those who participated in that plan in that pool. Now, the only variable that all the committees have acknowledged would be part of the initial plan is age. And the range in age differences goes from 3 to 1 in some committees to 5 to 1 in others. That is, somebody like me, older, would be paying 5 times what somebody like somebody in their 20s would pay. So, but that's called a community rating. And in fact, it's technically called a modified community rating because it's modified for age. That's the second condition. The third condition is that there would have to be a minimum benefits plan so that everybody would have at least a floor of coverage within that pool. Now, anybody could participate if they are prepared to meet those 3 criteria. So if you're in South Dakota and you don't have insurance or you don't like the insurance you've got, you'd be able to go in the exchange. It'd be online. You'd pick from, let's say, 15 different companies that are all competing for your business. You'd look at their different options and make your choice. In some cases, if subject to your income, if you're 200 to 300% below or above the poverty line, you get some help from the government to make that purchase. That's how it would work.
You're going to have to explain it a few more times before I understand it. I mean, in order to be able to walk into it. Isn't that part of the problem?
That is part of it. It's not, it's complicated. But keep in mind, right now we have 1,300 insurance companies doing that all over the country. And, it is extremely complicated. Yeah. People say, well, it's so complicated to talk about reform. Well, that's because our system is so complicated. And you've got to, they say, well, all these bills are several hundred pages. My God, who's going to be able to sift through several hundred pages? Well, if you're going to put our system in a bill form today, it would probably be 5,000 pages because it's so complicated.
Can we talk about some of what I consider to be sort of internal conflicts, at least that I have? I'm sure everybody else in this room has fewer internal conflicts than I do, but I'm talking about one. When I say I want high quality, affordable care, what I really mean is I want as expensive a care as I can get, but I want somebody else to pay for it. Do you think that's an uncommon belief, or am I just sort of an outlier here in this issue? I don't see people clamoring to have, go into a hospital and have 3 other patients in a room with them. I don't hear them clamoring to pay, nurse assistants more in long-term care facilities if their cost of care is going to go up. It seems to me that that one of the starting points almost has to be, look, we're the richest nation on earth. We want expensive health care. We don't want cheap health care.
Well, but see, I guess I would say I disagree with that because I don't think there's much of a relationship these days between cost and quality, especially in the United States. There was a famous article that I'm sure you read by Atul Gawande in the New Yorker that made that case very, very compellingly. It compared Mayo Clinic with care in McAllen, Texas. And care in McAllen, Texas is about twice as expensive as care in Minnesota. But all of the statistics, all of the outcomes are dramatically lower than what they are in Minnesota.
Yeah, I read that article as well. I know it's gotten wide circulation, but the Mayo Clinic in the hospital in McAllen, Texas is a community hospital. You go to Mayo, get your care, and go back to McAllen, where it can be very, very expensive. So I found the comparison to be, I found a little misleading in that regard. I just come back to it. I don't see people when they go into a hospital saying, "Can you give me a room with 4 or 5 other people in there because I'd like to get affordable. I'd like to make my contribution to affordable health care." And I don't. And people say, "Well, we spend whatever, I don't know what it is, a huge amount of money the last 6 months of life." Well, I hear a lot of volunteers. When it comes to the last 6 months of my life, I'm not going to say, "Well, okay, don't spend it on me. I'll make my contribution," because our nature is to try to save a life. And it can be expensive as heck to save a life. And we don't know. Sometimes we save it and sometimes we don't. And if we don't, it's in the last 6 months of life. And if we do, it's in the last 10 years of life.
But but the difference, Bob, is that I think that, you know, we expect care to be as good as it can be, but we just today don't get what we pay for. And that, I think, is one of the big challenges of health reform, to figure out how we can improve value. I mean, when we pay today $8,000 for every man, woman, and child in the country in taxes, premiums, and out-of-pocket expenses. Switzerland's the second most expensive country, and they pay about $5,000. So we pay almost twice as much as the second most expensive country. We come in 37th in outcomes. So we could pay $10,000, and that's not going to improve our quality. We've got to figure out, and part of the reason why is because healthcare looks like a pyramid. At the base of the pyramid, you've got good primary care and wellness. You work your way up that pyramid until you get to the most sophisticated care at the top, which is MRIs and heart transplants, the most technological applications. Every country in the world starts at the base of their pyramid. They work their way up until the money runs out. And the money runs out. We start at the top of the pyramid, and we work our way down until the money runs out. And for us, the money runs out even though we spend $8,000 per capita. So we never get to the base of the pyramid where we could provide the cheapest, most effective care. And that's one of the challenges. Can we invert the pyramid to put the money where it could do the most good? It starts with that. We also have 1 out of every $4 we spend is spent on administration, on paperwork, on costs associated with running the system, in part because we have 1,300 insurance companies, in part because we have a 21st century operating room, we have a 19th century administrative room.
This is starting to get to be fun, this conversation.
So
we also
I mean, that's where the money's going.
We
That's
also
my
have
point.
a healthcare guild called the AMA that limits the number of doctors that get produced by our medical schools. Try to start a medical school in this country. You can't just start a medical school in this country. So we're producing a relatively small number of doctors against what the actual demand is. And the reimbursement rates are set by the feds, which produces suspicions. I mean, it isn't just that we start at the top and work down. We have reimbursement rates at the DRGs that pay people more to cut than they do to examine the patient. And so not surprisingly, they tend to cut more because they're getting paid more. You know, if they paid $1,000 to cut off my left ear, there'd be a lot of people in this country with left ears that were missing. So the payment system at the federal level seems to me drive this thing.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, we don't pay for primary care. It isn't reimbursable. It's out-of-pocket coverage, so people don't use it. And we've seen a precipitous decline, 40% decline in the last 10 years of primary care doctors in this country. And what we're finding now is that more and more doctors come from other countries, mostly developing countries. And that's a real shame. We import the equivalent of 100 medical schools who would graduate 50 doctors a year from other countries, mostly from developing parts of the world.
You know, on the level of education, my favorite program that's not very well understood by people is renal dialysis. And the reason I like renal dialysis, it's paid for under Medicare. There's no means test. There's no income test. There's no test at all. You got a kidney that needs dialysis. You go in and you can get renal dialysis. Now you can complain about the reimbursement rates, but we got one organ that's covered. All 300 million American citizens and legal residents that are in Medicare, they're eligible. You got a kidney that doesn't work, you get renal dialysis, and it's very, very efficient. Again, you can say, well, we're not reimbursement enough. One of the ideas that I've talked about off stage is, why not? If I was in the Senate now, I'd put an amendment up that would say, Congress has to get their health care through Medicare. So we say, okay, you got. No, I mean, seriously, there's nothing quite like going through something to understand it better. So, and I think suddenly they'd say, well, it's not such a bad system. It's kind of complicated, and the reimbursement rates are too low. It's not, so that's why the docs don't want to get in the system. It sort of makes sense. You get kidneys, Congress, waste, sort of. What do you think? Is that a goofball
Absolutely.
populist idea that?
Nothing like walking the walk, right?
But somehow, to your transparency case, somehow, of all the hopes I've got, I hope things pass that allow the American people to really understand what the facts are, who's paying, who isn't paying, because I'm with you. We're spending enough to cover everybody, and there's way too many solid research out there that shows that there's a cause and effect relationship between your access to health care and your capacity to take advantage of the American dream. I mean, your educational performance will drop off if you don't have health insurance. Your own health status will deteriorate. I mean, they just struck dental coverage in California under Medicaid. I mean, we're a very look-conscious society. You walk in and get a job and you've got a couple of teeth missing, it's not likely you're going to get a job. In California, because we're not paying for dental care now under Medicaid, my guess is 10 years from now there's going to be a lot of people walking in trying to get a job missing a couple of front teeth. I mean, there's just so much evidence that we're doing damage to ourselves. That my hope is that something in the transparency area gets in there so that the next time that President Obama wants to lead on this issue, it's more likely that something in a comprehensive way gets done.
Well, we have a system that we really backed into, and we have been putting together piece by piece without any real appreciation of what this system looks like. I think you could make the argument we really don't have a system at all.
I agree.
We don't have a system. We have a series of mini systems that sometimes fit and sometimes don't. But, and going to transparency, it's estimated we lose about 100,000 lives every year to medical mistakes. 100,000 a year. A bunch of analysts have acknowledged that that's the figure that's generally accepted. That comes out to about a 747 every day and a half. Assuming a 747 would crash, God forbid, what would happen? You'd have the NTSB out there within hours. You'd have a full investigation of what could have happened. You have a black box. And within months, you'd have a system that allows for a report and some way with which to correct whatever malfunction would have occurred. And yet a 747 in healthcare crashes every day and a half. We don't have a clue what happened, why those people lost their lives. And we actually have a lot of people who are opposed to even the utilization of best practices so we can stop those things from happening in the future.
You've got some very good metaphors here, I gotta say. I'm impressed.
Well, but it's really, I mean, that transparency issue is huge.
This is my last question, then I don't know whether Stephen Kimberly's got the cards or somebody's got the cards so I can start taking some questions from the audience. But Bill Bradley, I don't know if you saw the piece that he wrote a couple weeks ago about a grand swap. Is that a possibility that you could swap out tort reform to get some Republicans to come on board with more comprehensive coverage?
Well, I have argued for years now that what we ought to do is to say, look, if a doctor will use best practices, and if it can be documented that he or she used best practices, you give them safe harbor. And you make them advocates rather than adversaries in this what happened process after a mistake occurred. First of all, you set up a fund, kind of a compensation fund for those who are still victims of mistakes when and if they occur. But you take this all out of the litigation mode and put it back into the transparent, reactive mode that allows us to solve these problems once they come up. I think it's the only way we're going to fix the system, making doctors advocates rather than adversaries.
Okay, I need a question. I just have to look for somebody I trust. Mike Geller, do you have a question? But before you pass the card in, you just ask the question and I'll repeat it. The question is, if the principles are agreed to, isn't the outcome going to be determined by which lobbyist group spends the most? And I think I already tipped my hand earlier, so what do you think?
Well, actually, I have to say I have more confidence in Congress than that. I know that people have a right to be very skeptical and even cynical, but and I'm not suggesting that the questioner is, but I look at what the House did, and I'm very proud of what the House did. I look at what President Obama is advocating, and I'm very proud of what he's advocated. I mean, if we get done what the President has advocated and what the House has passed in the 3 committees, or what the Help Committee has now passed in the Senate, we can look back on this day as a very transformational moment. I think that we could change the landscape in health reform in a very, very constructive and positive way.
You do have a change, it seems to me as well, from 93 and 94. where the major participants in healthcare, pharmaceutical companies, insurance companies, have come to the table and stayed at the table saying we want to participate in this in some way. Is that?
I would say of all the factors that are different, other than the exacerbated conditions that we're dealing with, the single biggest change is the stakeholders' role this time versus last time. At this point in the last debate, you saw these Harry and Louise ads and all kinds of efforts to kill health reform. You aren't seeing that from the stakeholders this time, and that's encouraging.
But first question, I'll just kind of go in order here. Couldn't the argument made to the American public on the public option, that it essentially inverts the pyramid and allows us to save billions of dollars by doing preventative care?
I'm a strong, strong advocate. I will tell you this. I believe that whether it happens this year or at some point in the future, a public option is inevitable. It will happen just because there is no other way to do it. And because of all the reasons. I mean, you're either going to have a very significant regulatory architecture to monitor and to regulate these exchanges, or you've got to have the competition that comes from a public option. It's one or the other. I find it amusing that the insurance industry has said, given competition or regulation, we'll take regulation. You don't see many industries begging for more regulation, but that's how concerned they are. And the other thing, and I know you want to get on to, the other thing that I find amusing in the public option debate is that the opponents say, well, if we have a public option, everybody's going to rush to it and it's going to destroy the insurance industry. Well, my question is, who are we building this for, the insurance industry or the American people, first of all? And secondly, their argument, ironically, is we oppose it because it's going to be so popular and it's going to be so successful. Not a logical way to take on an argument of that kind, it seems to me.
It just occurs to me, I mean, actually, in a very real way, the renal dialysis program already is a public option.
It is.
Because you don't have to wait to be 65.
Medicare is a public option.
Medicare itself is a public option, right. There's a question here that, from a student perspective, the medical students graduate with a considerable amount of debt, average approaching $200,000. It necessitates physicians choosing oftentimes to move up. A surgical component, for example, I mean, they oftentimes choose beyond something other than what they might prefer to do, just because of that. Is there merit in that? And if so, do you think examining ways to provide incentives for medical students to go into primary care by addressing the student loan issue is a smart thing to do?
I think there's sort of a crass phrase that everybody can identify with. You follow the money in healthcare. And if you follow the money, doctors go where they go in large part because of the money, starting with medical school. I mean, they're incented to go into specialties because that's where the money is. And we have to reverse that. We have to, I think it's penny wise and pound foolish for the government not to offer full ride scholarships for anybody who wants to go into primary care. Because right now, what I would suggest, we used to have this, Bob, as you know, and in the last 8 years the program was gutted, but we used to have something called the National Health Service Corps. It still exists, but it's almost completely unfunded. We ought to fully fund the National Health Service Corps and say to a primary care medical student, you go into medical school and become a primary care physician, and then work for the government for 3 years when you get out, and we'll pay for your medical school. I think that's a fair trade, and it's a win-win. We need more primary care doctors. Doctors need that financial incentive. And then what we have to do is to reward them once they're in the primary care field and pay them what specialists get today. We can't have the disparity between primary care physicians and specialists and expect the outcome to be any different. So they have to be rewarded financially, just as specialists are rewarded today.
Okay, here's a question that I don't understand and causes me afraid to ask it, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Why not repeal Rule 22? Do you know what that's all about?
We're probably talking about Rule 22 in the Senate and the relevancy rule. And
so why not repeal Rule 22?
Well, I think Rule 22 relates to relevancy. That is, you know, if I recall my parliamentary procedure in the Senate, Rule 22 related to the degree to which you can offer legislation subject to the filibuster and have to get the 60 votes. Repealing Rule 22 would give you a lot more legislative flexibility, and you know, I think we're getting to that point. Filibusters have now become so dominant a part of the landscape in the Senate that you need a supermajority to do anything. And I think that's increasingly becoming a real problem in terms of our ability to govern. We have huge issues, pressing issues that have to be addressed. And you know, we can't rely on a supermajority every single time one of these controversial issues come up, or we'll never get anything done.
Here's a question that I find quite interesting, because anytime everybody opposes a proposal, I think, well, it's probably pretty good. So the question is, what do you think of the strengthened MedPAC proposal, and what are the chances it's going to be in comprehensive or in healthcare reform?
I can't tell you how strongly I feel about that.
You want to explain it first?
Yeah. Well, right now, believe it or not, Congress is actually called upon to determine the reimbursement rate for what doctors get through Medicare and what providers get across the board. I mean, they actually have to vote on the price of oxygen, you know, for home health care. They have to vote on all kinds of reimbursable items. And they have to make very, very tough political votes constantly in order to manage the healthcare system. Well, what some of us have suggested is that we take that managerial responsibility away from Congress, at least initially, give them the right to override if they feel the need. But we really did that. You know, we had this is probably a terrible analogy these days, but that's really what we did with the Federal Reserve. We had the Great Panic of 1907, and we created the Federal Reserve system in about 1913 as a result of the Great Panic, largely. And we delegated the responsibility for the monetary system to an independent, politically autonomous board. Now, sometimes it's worked, obviously sometimes it hasn't. But if you'd ask Congress today to have to vote every month or so on whether interest rates ought to go up or down, and how we ought to regulate our monetary system today, you can just imagine how much more of a mess we'd be in. And I think that we really have to come to that conclusion with medical care. We have to give somebody the ability to regulate, to manage it in a thoughtful way, with political insulation, with authority, and with the ability ultimately to look at this in a routine manner on a very regular basis. Today that doesn't happen. Once in a while we conjure up the necessary votes to do something that is really required. But a good example is something called the sustainable growth rate, which is the target we set for doctors who are reimbursed from Medicare every year. We haven't been able to deal with just that issue for over 5 years. And so Congress has demonstrated its lack of capacity to make these tough regulatory decisions on a regular basis. Somebody has to do that, and that's what the Super MedPAC is designed to do.
But it seems like it's one of the most unpopular of the proposals that is being down there, and it causes me to be suspicious that both the industry that goes to Congress and lobbies for those specific reimbursement rates, and perhaps even Congress itself, that receives individual and PAC contributions from industries that are grateful for whatever rate that was set, that you could have one of these situations where it may be in the nation's interest to do it, but in the short term, it's not in either the Congress or the industry's interest to make the change. Is that too cynical?
No, it's not. It's going to be a tough thing to do. But I will say again, all 4 of the committees that have acted so far have something in it, either a Super MedPAC or some kind of a board that would allow varying degrees of authority with regard to decision making. So I think that in spite of your correct assumption that it's very difficult, Congress is loath to give up authority and responsibility. The groups affected are loath to see just what the board might come up with. the end of the
It's going to
day,
be easier for them to lobby Congress than it is to lobby MedPAC.
absolutely, absolutely. But at the end of the day, if we're really going to contain costs and make these tough decisions, somebody with some political insulation is going to be required to do it.
I mean, and Senator Daschle really is understating the folly. I mean, I was, thanks to you, a member of the Finance Committee. And the first time I had to do this, I looked at the bill, and my staff brings me the bill, and it's like 50 pages of reimbursement rates. How much should I pay for cataract removal? How much should I pay for renal dialysis? And on and on and on and on. And to say that I was unqualified to make that decision is to give me a lot more benefit than I probably deserve. I mean, not only was I unqualified, I wasn't even close to being capable of making those decisions. Not even close. I didn't have the preparation to do it, didn't have the staff to do it. And so it was basically either a budget-driven exercise or a lobbyist-driven exercise.
And to put that in the context of a typical day for a member of the Senate, you served on the Intelligence Committee, so you went from intelligence to finance, where you had to deal with the reimbursement rates, to the war in Afghanistan or Iraq or wherever. I mean, just the broad responsibilities that you have to make these decisions. This is just a small segment of it, and it makes it all the harder to make the right ones over and over again.
Well, and as you know, I mean, intelligence wasn't required to get admitted on either of those committees. That's the problem. I mean, it really is. I mean, it gets back to what I was talking about earlier. I really worry about the fundamental underpinnings of democracy on these issues. Again, especially you got the Supreme Court taking up the question of whether or not to repeal the prohibition of corporate expenditures. I mean, I think it's bad now. Actually, it's worse for the corporations in some ways, because they're going to be duty-bound to say to their share owners that we're spending as much money as possible advertising whatever our interests are. So I worry about it, and MedPAC's, and enhanced MedPAC's a very good example. It makes so much sense, other than I might have to give up power in order to get it done.
That's right.
It says here, if the public option goes off the table, what will be the next supposed deal breaker for Republicans? Okay, this is right. So it's true. I mean, well, I don't think I like the public option. I'll think about it. And I thought about it for 90 days. And anybody that's got spent, I don't know, a couple of months watching politics goes over to Mike Enzi and Chuck Grassley. We're going to support a public option. Okay, so now that's a deal breaker. What's the next deal breaker?
Well, there's just all kinds of issues out there. What they're saying is that the level of subsidy is too high, that we shouldn't be subsidizing people to the extent that we are. That's supposedly a deal breaker for some. I think that the degree to which, how we create these exchanges, and whether or not we force the states to take the responsibility under Medicaid, that's for Senator Enzi. He said that was a deal breaker. He wanted the federal government. He took your cue and he said, I think the federal government ought to pay for it all, not the states.
Well, if you went with a strong public, man, this is where it feels like the Red Queen's setting the rules. Because, I mean, if he had a strong public option, that would have happened. So he killed the strong public option. Now he objecting to the thing that's caused by his defeat of the strong public option, right? I mean, I'm capable of being sympathetic to the Republican point of view, but I'm baffled by it. Is it just true that? No, is it an ideological part of the Republican Party, and they just genuinely believe that?
I think it's two things, Bob. I think, first of all, it is ideological. As I said earlier, I think there's this deep distrust of the government and anything they do except in defense. And, and they'll fund anything that explodes, but that stops there. And then there are those, unfortunately, there are those who really want the president to fail. I mean, Jim DeMint was the most vocal and the most transparent about it. He said, I want health care to be Barack Obama's Waterloo. And he was very clear. And there are those who really believe that if Barack Obama fails on this, his presidency will be viewed as a failure, and that will put them in a position to regain control of the Congress and ultimately the White House in 2 and 4 years.
I was confused by that comment as well because I didn't know which side he was talking about. So maybe he was hoping that he would win. Here's a very specific question. I've also heard it a lot as well, which is people who are on this. A person who's my wife and I'll just read it. My wife and I are on Medicare and HMO insurance, Aetna. And the question is, under President Obama's plan, would the HMO be eliminated?
No, it would not. HMOs would still be part of the system. The president has made it very clear, and he said it over and over again, if you like what you've got, you ought to be able to keep it. So there's a real effort to try to preserve the things that the American people have embraced, and HMOs are part of that. They will stay as they are today.
Here's a question I think that I understand, and since whoever wrote it won't know if I'm reading theirs, I'll make an attempt to get it right. It's also something I've heard a lot, which is, don't we need to get the economy growing before we do this? We got unemployment heading to 10%. All in, it's probably 15% by the time you count people who have given up looking and are underemployed is probably larger than that. Should we be putting all of our energy into making the economic pie grow before we start figuring out how to redistribute the pie that we have?
Well, the president has a very compelling answer, and he can answer this question a lot better than I can, but he's been asked that very question many times. And his answer is that this is part of economic recovery. It has to be part of economic recovery. That it's getting close to 20% of our gross domestic product. And when Ford Motor Company spends $1,500 per car for health insurance, BMW spends $650 per car for health insurance, and Honda spends $450 per car for health insurance, that is a huge competitive disadvantage. That alone is one of the economic forces. But when it's growing as exponentially as it is, and a typical family today spends about $1,100 of their insurance premium paying for the costs offered to others who don't have insurance today. That cost shifting is going to get worse, not better, if we don't fix this problem. So I guess the bottom line, Bob, is that there are a lot of economic arguments that the president and others have used to make, I think, a very compelling case that you can't solve the economic issues in this country if we don't solve the health issues in this country.
Do you think that it's a compelling case to you and I? Do you think it's persuading a majority in the country?
I think it's persuading a majority, but certainly not. It doesn't generate the unanimity you'd like.
Right. Yeah. Because it's in the short term. What I need is a job.
Right.
And if I get a job, maybe I get health insurance. So.
But only 38% of small business today offers health insurance. 38. 20 years ago it was 61%.
Now that reminds me. There's a comedian by the name of Larry the Cable Guy. You know Larry the Cable?
I sure do,
right.
Yeah.
Larry the Cable Guy said that 78.27% of all statistics are made up on the spot. Now, you didn't just do that, did you?
You'll never know, will you?
I won't, actually. Here's a question, actually, that reinforces actually a Republican suggestion that I heard recently, that Olympia Snow, who I think is genuinely trying to be a part of a bipartisan solution, she suggested that we needed to change the law so insurance companies could sell health insurance across state lines. And that's this question: why not do that? So in New York, if there's a lower cost offering someplace right now, it's very difficult to buy it. So is that a reasonable suggestion?
It is, and I think if we set minimum federal standards, so that what happens now is because insurance is regulated at the state level, not the federal level, it's always a race to the bottom. And so they'll go to the state with the least regulation and the least amount of oversight and start selling insurance from there. And without any control over that, a lot of people are going to buy it thinking that they've got coverage and finding out later that they don't. And so in order to prevent that, you'd need to have some sort of a minimum standard regulatory framework within which everybody would have to comply. But if you did that, I think having a virtual pool, a national pool by, say, virtual, I mean, on the internet, where you could buy regardless of where you are, is a way that could solve a lot of the administrative costs.
I think it's a very important question, but the underlying law is called McCarran-Ferguson, and it cites at the state the power to regulate insurance, all insurance,
Right.
health, life, as well. So that used to be, almost like Social Security in terms of the trouble you could get in talking about it. But it does seem to me to be, at this moment, something more and more insurance companies are embracing. Do you think it's possible that could be in the final legislation?
I do. I think that is a
An optional
possibility.
federal charter of some kind that allows.
Exactly.
And now, this is another question that I've heard asked an awful lot, which is, do you think the president can be faulted by or for hyper-learning from the 1994 mess and giving too much of the authority over the details to Congress?
Well, I look again. I mean, it's pretty hard to argue that when you've got 4 out of the 5 committees that have done their work and it's turned out where they get an A- or a B+ for the product that they've produced, I can't fault that. I mean, obviously, I wish the Senate would be farther along, in the Finance Committee in particular, but nonetheless, he said, I'm going to be clear with regard to my goals, I'm going to be clear with regard to my expectations, but I'm going to give the Congress the opportunity to work with me in full partnership. He's done that. And, ultimately, the question is, will this produce the results we want? So far, 4 out of 5 committees have said we can do it.
Suffice, I might have answered that question differently, but I'll leave that one alone for the moment. Well, does it make sense to you, Tom, that this is another question I've heard a lot that seems to be a reasonable question, to add 45 million people to a broken system rather than fixing the cost and quality issues of the underlying system first?
Absolutely. We have to. I don't think we solve one without addressing the other. The reason why comprehensive health insurance reform is so necessary, or health reform is so necessary, is because there's such an interrelationship. Massachusetts did a fantastic job in the last couple of years of passing a new bill that requires and allows for universal coverage. But they really didn't deal with the cost side of things. So now they're dealing with huge cost issues there that have to be addressed. We've got to understand the very intricate interrelationship between cost and access and quality and address all of them simultaneously so as not to exacerbate 2 that we didn't address if we only looked at 1.
Yeah, this is a question as well that I could tell stories about, which in my own view is one of the most difficult things to do is to develop a system that says, okay, you can get this at this place and you have to go someplace else to get another. I mean, Nebraska is very similar to South Dakota in that way. When the VA was under a lot more budget stress than they are today, one of the things that we did was, if you're out in the western part of the state where the population is smaller, there you get primary care. And in the larger population centers, you could get more advanced care. I don't need to go into the details of it, but you can imagine the opposition that you'd face in each one of these places when suddenly you were going to be removing something from them that they're already doing. I'm not sure this question goes precisely at that, but it gets into the neighborhood, I think. The quality of advanced medical infrastructure in the United States is completely unequal. For example, the Department of Radiology at Memorial Sloan Kettering can molecularly diagnose and image tumors in a way impossible in much of the United States. So the question is, what ideas are out there in the health reform debate that might address this?
Well, that's a very serious problem. I mean, South Dakota has huge problems in terms of quality, in part because of the lack of good providers, the lack of the number of providers necessary. I mean, we're lucky in many parts of our state to have a physician's assistant at a clinic out there for 100 miles in any direction. And life expectancy on Indian reservations in South Dakota is much lower, dramatically lower than it is for the rest of the population, in part because of the shortage of providers and the shortage of good facilities. So we've got to figure out ways that we can more equalize, and I think starting with the realization that primary care could be the base of the pyramid for everybody, and that we could do things through better technology and more clinics. There is a movement to provide more clinics all over the country, and it's a very healthy movement. I'm very excited about it. But we still have a long way to go. And part of it is because, as I said earlier, we really don't have a system. We have all these little composites that are part of a system, but we've got to make it a system. And if we do, we're going to start to address some of these inequities.
You know, one of the things that that comes to my attention, mostly as a result of either personal experience or experience in the Congress, is that we have a number of federal laws that create specialized eligibility for subsidies. And we transfer taxes from one group of people to another in order to cover the subsidy. That's a given. That goes on all the time. First was veterans care. That's the first time we did it. Veterans and military care are federal systems under federal law. There's a law passed that says here's how you become eligible for care in the Veterans Administration system, and it helps if you've got blown up in a war. I mean, that really gets you in a hurry. It's a pretty tough threshold to get over. But those are the first two. And then in the Second World War, Congress passed a subsidy, depending on how you look at it, either for the health insurance industry or for people buying health insurance, allowing deductibility and an offset on FICA. So it's subsidizing that purchase in a very unequal way, because your subsidies go up the higher your income goes. So that's another one. Then Hill Burton comes in in the 50s. That's not as not as well remembered because it's 50 years ago. But in 60s, there's two big programs, Medicare and Medicaid. One that says you have to prove that you're old enough, except if you got a kidney that's malfunctioned, that you don't have to prove anything for that. In Medicaid, you have to be poor and promise to stay poor, and you're covered in that program.
But you also have to have a child.
Yeah, and you have to have a child now, right? So, those are the primary programs, and each case, and then you have a whole bunch of others, by the way. One of my favorite moments in '93 and '4 just caused me to say, gee, what am I doing? I had somebody come up and raise Cain about socialized health care. And I said, where do you work? Well, I work for the Lincoln Public Schools. And I said, well, who the hell do you think's paying your health insurance? It's private health insurance. It's paid by the taxpayers. You moron. Jesus. So every public employee, city, county, state, federal, it's all a tax transfer.
Did you really call him a moron?
No, I didn't. In 2000, I would have, after I said yes to the new school. But I mean, it's baffling to me. So you have all these multiple ways to become eligible. And it seems to me, if you could, again, it's the education side, if you get people to understand that we're already paying taxes to subsidize somebody else, and almost all of us are being subsidized by somebody else as well, and that it would be easier just to start and say, okay, you got 300 million Americans and legal residents, and you're all in. That's how you prove. Wouldn't it be easier just to create a simplified system of eligibility that doesn't require to get blown up in a war or prove all that?
Absolutely. Well, every other industrialized country in the world has done just that. And we really continue to grapple with all this eligibility stuff, and it's making it far more complicated than it has to be. It seems to me if you need, everybody ought to be covered, period. It ought to be just settled, and we go from there. But it's a very difficult thing for those in public policy, in part because of budget, in part because of the question who pays and how much do you pay, and eligible for what? Is it minimum benefits or is it something beyond that? But I mean, you can complicate it pretty quickly. But the bottom line should be everybody in America, for the first time in history, ought to expect the right to be covered.
But doesn't it take you as well to, and it's in your book, so I'm setting you up with a question, doesn't it take you to the need to examine the reform of the federal agency that makes the payment, CMS? And isn't it possible, rather than having a single payer, that you end up with multiple payers or do you think thinking about a reform agenda for the federal center inside of HHS is not important? Do you think it's important to think about reforming it?
It is. I would take it outside of it, HHS and CMS, because those are just 4 federal programs. And really, if we're going to have a system, we ought to have an architecture for the entire system, not just the federal government side. And really, that's the best we can hope for this year, is that we create a new framework in large measure for, for both the federal side as well as the private side, and we integrate those for the first time. Right now, we have these huge stovepipes, and those stovepipes keep us from integrating and from creating a seamless system. And that's really got to be one of the goals of health reform. Create that seamless system that has an architecture that can be regulated in an appropriate way.
There's a couple of questions in here on that, but I do believe strongly that you could get more enthusiasm for increased federal involvement if we talked about how we need to change that federal involvement to make it more transparent, make it more accessible to good decision making. Because CMS that's a tough nut to crack. I mean, I'm not sitting up here saying that they're terrible, but it's very difficult, even if you're on the Finance Committee or Ways and Means Committee, to have much influence over what they're doing.
Well, that's why I think we have to seize the moment right now. I mean, people are more sensitive to it now. We've probably, even though it's been a raucous debate and a lot of misinformation, I think the American people are probably a lot more aware of a lot of this than they were a year ago. And it's part because they've been subjected to both the good and the bad about this debate. And, if we don't seize this moment, if we let it go and then come back 5 years from now and try to do it again, we've got to rebuild all of that investment and effort to educate, and who knows where it'll all take us.
I'm very proud of the questions that are being asked here, and I would be comfortable turning over the whole thing to this audience, because they certainly seem to understand a lot more than the people who are at least debating it on television. Here's a question to make that point. If you go to reconciliation, will the insurance exchange fit within the budget track, or does it have to be passed separately? And if so, what are the implications? Would it pass separately? And similar question for the individual mandate.
That's a great question. And the answer is, in both cases, the exchange and the mandate would fall outside the budget track. So it gives you some indication of the difficulty. Now, the good news is that there is fairly broad support, even among some Republicans, for these exchanges and the pool. Not, I would guess you could maybe get 60+ votes, maybe even 70 votes for these exchanges, just because people understand that if you're going to create a private system, there aren't many better ways to do it than what has been proposed here. But it isn't budget driven, and so it has to fall outside the purview, as does a mandate, unfortunately.
Okay, I had a question here earlier. You got a piece of this, but I'm going to give you a chance to do it one more time. Why would insurance companies prefer to be forced to take all insurance applicants instead of having the uninsured enroll in public option?
Well, what the insurance companies have said is, if you mandate insurance for everybody, if you require that they have to take everybody, and if you subsidize the premiums, then we're prepared to accept this guaranteed issue at a modified community rating. So that's the trade-off. I mean, what they get out of it is not only 50 million new customers, if that's the number of uninsured, but you also get a lot of people who are underinsured today at a much higher level of coverage. So that it really is a good win-win for the insurance companies. But the key for them is to get universal coverage and to mandate that everybody be part of that pool.
Here's a fun one. Of the 50 million people who are uninsured, there's actually two parts. How many of those 50 million are illegal?
15 million.
15 million. And is it true that actually both President Obama and the unfortunate Congressman Wilson agree that the law should prohibit subsidies to people who are here illegally?
Correct. There is unanimous agreement about subsidies, but keep this in mind. I mean, it's what happens if an illegal immigrant today comes up with H1N1? What happens? Are you going to say, well, it is illegal for us to treat you. Go out there and just conduct your business. I mean, how many people actually think that's what's going to happen? So it's kind of an irrational debate, because we know we aren't going to have any choice If something like that were to happen, and there are many other scenarios I could describe, but that's one of the more compelling, it seems to me, what are you going to do? Right now, what happens is that person comes in, they don't ask for your citizenship, they treat you, and it's cost shifted onto everybody else if that person is incapable of paying themselves. But the law is clearly going to state in this health reform that anybody who is here illegally is not eligible for health care.
Are you saying that on this issue that both the President and Congressman Wilson are wrong?
Well, I'm saying that not necessarily that they're wrong, but what I'm saying is that you're still not going to be able. You can make the case that they shouldn't be eligible for subsidy, but you're still going to have to confront the reality, which is, under certain circumstances, you can't deny care because society as a whole is going to be the ultimate victim.
Well, yeah, it is going to be very difficult if you have a life-threatening situation, or even just a normal healthcare situation for physicians who have taken a Hippocratic oath to turn them away. So, but it's the contention, it seems to me, on that issue. I apologize for that. Is does the government have the capacity to enforce it? You'll have the provision in the law, but do the feds have the capacity to enforce the law that will prohibit the providing of the care and the subsidy?
Well, obviously they have the capacity. They would have to require some form of identification to fully implement the law. The question is whether they, we have those laws today. And oftentimes, in spite of the fact that we supposedly have the capacity, we don't use the capacity we have to follow through with the letter of the law.
So here's another one that, this is why I think when you're elected to Congress, no matter what your age, 30-year-old member of Congress, you get your health insurance from Medicare. The question is, I do medical billing. Why do they make it so hard to get claims paid? All the back and forth is so costly for everyone. An example, Medicare has an annual deductible. Instead of the deductible every year, just divide that by the amount, by 12, add it to the monthly premium. Would it be better for us to figure out a simpler way of doing the payment system, which right now, I don't know what the time lapse is, but it's not uncommon to hear this kind of a complaint, that it takes a long time and it's exceptionally difficult to be reimbursed. And it's not on the question. Again, to CMS, they consider the severity of an error where you're upbilling as great as the severity of the error that's underbilled. They're both errors, and they're regarded as the same. So if you ask for too much, everybody would say, yeah, you asked for too much, you should be penalized. But you can actually get penalized by asking for too little. So what about that? Is there anything in the reform that offers hope to?
Absolutely. First of all, it's very, very complicated because you have 1,300 different insurers. And then you have Medicare and Medicaid on top of that, and Medicaid changes from one state to the other. So you have a very complicated system. Secondly, most of it is still paper-driven. We're getting better, but we're still a long way from being where we should be. Third, you have fraud and abuse problems, and so they try to make these things as tough as they can make them to prevent the fraud and abuse that still exists today in numbers that shouldn't, and that's a problem. And they're trying to deal with the fraud and abuse both through Medicare and Medicaid as well as in the private sector. And then finally, we reward volume, we don't reward value. And so because we reward volume, the more procedures you have, the more the reimbursement's going to be. So we complicate it all by putting the emphasis on volume rather than value.
God, I wish you were HHS secretary. Sorry. 5 minutes left. I'm old enough to be able to say that I think this answer might make Roy Rogers very happy. What is a trigger option?
Well, a trigger option is generally referred to as we look at ways that the public option could be preserved, even if there is opposition to the robust public plan that has been proposed, especially by members in the House. The trigger option is a reference to what would happen if we try other approaches. Winston Churchill had a great line that I've used often. He was referring to Lend-Lease when he said it, I'm told, but he said he's confident that Americans will do the right thing after they've exhausted every other possibility. And the trigger refers to that notion. After we've exhausted every other possibility, what about triggering a public option? After we've shown that a co-op doesn't work, and after we've shown that the state insurance pools won't work unless there's a public option, what about saying in 5 years, if certain criteria aren't met, then we trigger a public option? In other words, it would be an automatic resetting of the landscape with regard to the insurance pools, with the role of a public option then becoming part of that landscape. That's what a trigger refers to. Olympia Snowe is one of the primary sponsors of that notion in the Senate and has argued that it should be included. The Finance Committee bill doesn't include a trigger option.
I didn't know that. That's an important fact. I mean, she's on the Finance Committee as well. That's unfortunate. Maybe it'll get adopted as an amendment on the floor. But I have two final questions. I'll put them together, both of which, again, make me proud of this audience. With conservative estimates in some states at 10% unemployment, many adults without the necessary leisure time to navigate the political system around this one issue are struggling to figure out what's right and wrong. Can you point people to a website or some place where accurate information about the process issues and the ways to educate themselves in a way that would allow them to have a constructive impact? And the second is, do you think that a health care bill without a public option will be successful in addressing or providing coverage for the 47 million Americans without health insurance coverage?
Well, I would say that one of the most authoritative and objective websites is the Department of Health and Human Services. They've got a very good section on the website having to deal with all these issues, definitions, and everything else. So my simple answer to the first part of the question is, look at the HHS website. They also have links to other websites if you're interested. There are other groups. The Kaiser Family Foundation does an extraordinary job of providing good analysis, and they have a website. Just Google Kaiser. And then the third one I would strongly recommend, well, two others. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation does a fantastic job of providing good analysis. And then the Commonwealth Fund also is one of the best analytical organizations out there. But those four sites are extraordinary. There isn't anything you could ask or look for that one of those sites wouldn't have. With regard to whether or not we can succeed without a public option, I will say in defense of those who argue that we shouldn't have one, a lot of European countries don't have a public option. And they've been able to provide coverage without it. Germany's a good example. They don't have a public option. But nonetheless, I think things are much easier, things are much simpler, and things would be a lot more clear were we to have one. And I'm hopeful at the end of the day, and as I said, I think ultimately in this country it's inevitable. We will have one. But it's just going to be a lot harder to get in there and accomplishing everything we want if we don't have one as this legislation is written now.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom, for coming.